see so many participants in the meeting today. I would also like to remind that this meeting is being recorded in audio and video. I wouldn't say in high definition because that would not be the case. And later on, we will be posting this video on the Eurospace YouTube channel for anyone to vision afterwards. So this is really very much a public presentation. So keep this in mind also when you go through questions, comments, and remarks. This will be recorded and posted publicly on YouTube. So my name is Pierre Lyonnais. For those who don't know me, I'm the Research and Managing Director of Eurospace. And this is our annual presentation of the release of the Eurospace annual Facts and Figures report. We had a little Larsen. Hello, Charlotte. I see you put your microphone off, which is very good. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. So I will be sharing today with you. You can turn your camera off, Charlotte, although we appreciate seeing you, but this will save bandwidth for the meeting. Thank you very much. So I will be presenting today an overview of the findings of the annual Facts and Figures survey of Eurospace. This is a proprietary survey that we produce for the past 29 years, which is quite a long time already. And in the context of this presentation, I will also try to put those figures in context with general global trends in space markets and also some elements of appreciation of one of the main revenue sources for the European space industry, which is within the European institutional space programs. So I will be presenting also a few elements of the European space budget consolidation. I would like to recall that every data set, every representation, every graphic that we do is based on our own economic intelligence. We are not reproducing anything which is produced externally. We do our own research and we present our own findings. Of course, usually they are well aligned with what other analysts doing the same type of work are actually doing, but we are using our own methodology and our own work. With regard to the Eurospace Facts and Figures survey, these figures are uniquely sourced by Eurospace with the industry that participates in our annual survey, where we collect data on sales and employment in the industry. This data is uniquely sourced by Eurospace. And before we start anything, I would really very much like to thank the companies that participate in this survey by releasing all the details of their sales and revenues to Eurospace in a confidential way that enables us to produce those consolidated figures that I will be sharing with you. The survey was done first and foremost for industries in Europe to be able to benchmark the situation, but it is also providing a set of very useful and important indicators for European space policymakers. So I will be jumping into the presentation right now. So let me go to the screen sharing button, select the right application, launch the share. Hopefully you are now able to see the presentation. And if everything looks fine now, it is in full screen.
Yes, it works.
Thank you, Charles. So, excuse me. So, in matter of introduction, this is the 29th edition of the annual Facts and Figures report, which is now published. It will be circulated to the people who are entitled to receive the report right after this presentation. So the report is ready. We will also be sharing the full set of slides on our website for everyone to download. So don't worry about doing screen caps or whatever. The PDF will be fully available for download for free on our website this afternoon. So really focus on looking at the figures, enjoying the presentation, because everything will be released. You can see that this year we've put on the cover, of course, the Ariane 6 launch of July. This was a big moment for Europe. You know, every time we get the maiden launch of a new launcher, it's a big event. And this one came a bit late, so it came up as a very big relief for the European space sector at large. So this was the event of the year, and it is now gracing the cover of a report. The picture, of course, is copyright by European Space Agency. Thank you very much for making those pictures available in Common Creative Commons license, so that we can use it for our report, which is not commercial. So I think we are all aligned with this. So the main elements of the presentation today is that in the European space industry, we're registering more growth in employment this year, 66,000 employees in the European space industry, which is a 4% growth compared to last year. And we see that the final sales are rebounding. They were at 8.5 last year. We are now at 8.8 billion euro, which is a 3% growth. Regretfully, productivity is still in decrease. So we have positive figures in the overall approach and the measures of the outcome of the survey this year. But as you will see in my commentary, regretfully, the situation is not as rosy as you would like or expect in the sector. So what are the key trends that we have identified for the European space industry? 3 points here. First, as I said, employment and consolidated sales are rebounding this year. So there is a slight improvement of the situation, the economic situation of the industry. But this is after 2 years of difficult economic situation for the sector. So it's good that we see this rebound, but we see that a lot of open issues remain. Indeed, the economic fundamentals of the industry are worrying. The sector profits are at an all-time low. We have our own survey at the level of Eurospace, where we have collected a lot of insider information from the member companies. We have also compiled data from a number of open sources. And really, we noticed that this is a long trend in the space sector, but not only in Europe. We have checked also American companies. Profits in the space sector are receding. In other words, if you're doing space systems manufacturing, if you're building launchers, if you're operating launchers, your economic fundamentals are not getting any better in recent years. In contrary, we see that a lot of companies are posting difficult profit situations. The sector productivity, of course, is receding as well. I believe that today we are facing a situation of potential overcapacity in the sector, despite the fact that institutional demand remains very, very strong. But the situation with the commercial demand is very much worrying. And as a result, everybody is fighting for their own game, which makes a lot of sense. But what we notice us at the level of the professional association is that sector cohesion is getting lower. Because again, individualism is getting stronger. So I would like to recall that playing the game together gives us more strength. So sector cohesion, which is low, could improve. And I believe that this could also help to improve the sector fundamentals. We see that market prospects for the European space industry exhibit diverging trend. The commercial accessible demand is at an all-time low. It's important to note the term accessible because space markets are very much organized in vertical silos at domestic level, which is a very strong trend for institutional programs, of course, but to some extent also a number of commercial demand is now not accessible to all players because the players and the demand is vertically integrated with manufacturing and launch. And this is the case, for instance, with Starlink and SpaceX, but also for OneWeb to a lesser extent, and for Kuiper to a very strong extent. The promise of the new space, I believe, is not yet realized. We are still expecting a lot of this potential new approach to making space more commercial, more affordable. But today, regretfully, this is not translating into material opportunities for the European space sector. This is regretful. Most of the growth potential today is driven by institutional programs which generate captive demand, which is organized domestically. This is also a very important trend. We see this happening everywhere. This is also very satisfying. You will see with my small overview of European space budgets that European governments are investing more and more in space. This is something that we see at the level of national and ESA programs, and it is also happening at the level of the European Union programs, which is really committing to funding a lot more of European space capabilities. So this is a very positive trend. which I believe makes a lot of sense in those difficult times, because space are important assets for a European presence on the geopolitical scene. So this is really a critical point, but regretfully, this growth in European space investment from the European governments is not compensating the loss the European industry is facing in the face of commercial programs. On the other hand, the other thing we notice is that European institutional cohesion is weakening. As you could see, there is a lot of national interest which is expressed in space programs, so that we see space programs organized at national level growingly. We see that the German government is making plans from their own constellation for communication and observation. We see that Italy is also investing a lot to support the national launcher and also national observation programs. We see really a strong push for national capabilities, which is clouding a little bit the global European interest of producing large European programs where everybody can actually participate at the best of their capabilities. So national interests are now prevailing into the growth of European space budgets, and that this has pros and cons. Of course, if you are an Italian player and you see that the Italian investment in space program is growing, this is a major opportunity for you to seize. But on the other hand, for Europe at large, it may create a situation of overlapping capabilities and difficulties in achieving the critical mass of creating those very large-scale programs that would enable Europe as a political entity to play a major role on the space global scene. So with those introductions gone, let's see the contents of the presentation today. So I will review the global context and the macroscopic space trends as we highlight them usually at Eurospace. I will also review a little bit the European space budget trends, as I said, and then I will finish up with the European space industry key data and facts, so that you can see how the fundamentals of the European space industry can be appreciated in a wider context. In between all those segments, I will make a small pause to enable people to raise comments and questions, if any. So what are the global trends that we have identified? So this is a slide which I like to present very often. So probably some of you have already seen it. How do we measure the space market today? Well, the easiest way is to count the satellites that have been launched. So you can see on this chart here, we are counting the number of satellites which have been launched every year, and we are separating between commercial programs funded by private entities and institutional programs funded by government money. And you can see that there is a very important trend of more satellites to be launched in orbit, which is really very visible on the term of commercial programs, and on a lesser extent for institutional programs as well. There have been, in between 2024 and recent years in 2013, 2012, we have seen a multiplication by 15 of the number of satellites being launched in space. But of course, this revolution in numbers of satellites launched is accompanied by a change in the average mass of satellites being launched. So when we measure the total mass deployed in orbit, there is still a lot of growth, which is also very visible on commercial programs more than it is visible on institutional programs. But we see that measured in mass, the growth in launch activity is about ×5 and not ×15 as it is measured in number. But when you translate this mass in actual market value, so which is the business opportunity that this growth is actually generating for the space industry, which is building satellites and launching them, you can see that the commercial value of those commercial programs is quite small. And this is indeed due to the fact that in order to enable commercial business cases in space, you have to dramatically lower the cost of space infrastructure in order to make those business cases to be viable. So this is the reason why today, despite the major growth we have noticed in commercial programs in terms of mass launch and number of satellites launched, the business opportunity that these programs are providing for the companies which are building satellites and launching them is not significantly growing. It is growing a little bit, but not significantly. On the other hand, we see that the global trend in growth in governmental programs is quite striking, and they're still providing most of the capability to fund the deployment of space infrastructure. Another point also, which is worth noting, is that most of the development of those commercial programs is really driven by one single entity, which is SpaceX and the deployment of the Starlink constellation. So when you look at this measure item that we develop at Eurospace, which is the total CapEx, the total CapEx is the actual cost incurred by customers of space infrastructure to actually acquire the satellite segment and launch it. The total CapEx is the sum of the cost of acquisition of the satellite infrastructure plus the launch service. This total segment is evolving like this. We are aggregating in this chart the 5 years of spending for government programs directly applicable to deployment of satellite infrastructure. This is not the total spending of governments in space programs. This is the share that is eventually flying in space and which has been deployed. And when you look at the trend in the past 5 years, we see that in 5 years, governments have provided $252 billion worth of funding for deploying space infrastructure, satellites which are actually flying and which have been launched. That's about 50 billion a year in average, globally speaking, which includes a lot of US and Chinese money, of course. And what you see here is interesting is because government spending is actually focusing on a few key applications. The most important one, which is providing the largest revenue opportunities for the space industry, which is building satellites and launching them, is of course associated to military programs that you can see on top of the slide here, which represent 50% of the total government spending for deploying satellite infrastructure in space. At the forefront of this spending, you see military observation programs, which are, looking at radar, optical, also signal intelligence, etc. This is the #1 opportunity for space industry worldwide, providing capabilities for military and tactical observation. Then, of course, you have human spaceflight, which represent a big lump of activity, and then a different spread of civil observation applications, space science and exploration, etc. But really, the main point here is that most of the opportunity is provided by military observation programs worldwide. On the other hand, if you compare this with the amount which is available from private capital to actually support the deployment of space infrastructure, again, here you have an aggregate of 5 years. You see that the total in 5 years was about $48 billion. This is the revenue opportunity for companies which are building satellites for private commercial application programs. It represents about $9.6 billion a year in average in the past 5 years. And the notable difference here is that most of this money is going to fund telecommunications applications, and actually half of that now has been absorbed by the deployment of the Starlink constellation. You see that civil observation applications are really very, very small compared to the actual funding which is going upfront to funding military observation programs. And you see that military communications as well are very small. Really, when you look at private funded development of satellite infrastructure and the launch of it, it's really about civil communications program. And the forefront of that, you have the business of geostationary satellite operators, which involves a lot of broadcast still, although it is receding, and a number of data access possibilities, including B2C, B2B, B2G, and broadband applications. And here you see that clearly Starlink is playing a growing role. So when you put all this global infrastructure demand in context, well, and looking at the regions, the customer regions, so who is actually buying for all those programs? You look here at the first chart, which is providing an assessment in tons of satellites launched, and you see that the USA is actually procuring most of the satellite infrastructure. But of course, this is heavily influenced by the importance of the Starlink constellation, which represent about 90 to 95% of the total demand from US customers that we registered here. In total, you will see that there are about now more than 2,000 tons of satellites which are launched in space every year. This has been a very significant growth compared to previous years, where we were between 350 and 400 tons every year. So this is really a major change which is happening under our eyes in recent years. When you look at the overall market opportunity, the average amount for deploying satellites in space is 55 billion total in 2024. This is the market opportunity for building satellites. And as you can see, most of this demand is coming from two regions, China at the bottom and the USA at the top in gray. Those two countries represent more than 80% of the total demand for satellite infrastructure worldwide. And most of that demand, of course, is funded by governments. And when you look at the value of the launch services market, which is associated to that demand, you will notice that basically the charts are the same, the histograms, just smaller because launch is only a fraction of the total cost of a program. And we estimate that in 2024, the launch demand represented a total demand of about $14 billion in the year. And again, of course, this demand is heavily biased towards US customers and Chinese customers, which represent the most of the launch demand, which is natural because launch demand is a subset of the satellite demand. You only launch because you acquire a satellite and not the other way around. So again, those big figures are interesting to look at. 55 billion for spacecraft demand and 14 billion for launch demand. So this is the market opportunity that we have measured. Of course, as I mentioned already, what has been really noticeable in recent years is the massive deployment of the Starlink constellation. Here you see the growth of the mass deployed in space on behalf of the Starlink constellation. And as you could see, in 2024, Starlink deployed 1,500 tons of satellites in orbit, which is really a massive amount. And when you compare that to what is happening everywhere else in the world, you see that if you separate Starlink from the rest, the total mass deployed to space in recent years has been growing slightly, but definitely there is no massive acceleration of growth of mass deployed in orbit that we have noticed in recent years. So you really need to understand that Starlink is a unique phenomenon, which is really applying a lot of changes in the total launch statistics and which is really changing the way the LEO orbit is being populated by satellites. And that this is one single player, which is putting a ton of pressure, really practically speaking, to the overall space environment and to the operations in LEO very specifically. When you look at all other programs, you see that indeed the growth has been very, very light in comparison. So when we compare the total mass launched on behalf of institutional programs on the left, and when we look at the spread between different applications and look at the evolution of this growth in recent years, we notice two very important trends. The first is that the mass deployed to space on behalf of remote sensing programs, which you can see here in orange, is actually one of the major elements of growth in recent years. And this goes back to the previous slide I was presenting. Most of that is associated to military observation programs. And this is showing us how space has become a critical asset for the military, for tactical and intelligence. This is really one of the key points. The other element of growth that we have noticed in recent years in terms of global applications is the actual growth in human activities. The mass which has been launched to space to support human presence in space has actually been growing quite a bit. And the main reason for that growth is the actual investment of the Chinese into the Chinese space station, which was really deployed in 21 and 22, and is now offering the Chinese and the Chinese allies a number of opportunities of actual presence in space in recent years. And this has been one of the key trends we have noticed also in recent years. If you compare the total mass deployed and you look at one simple indicator, which is the split between civil applications and military applications, you can see that differently than the budget available, the total mass associated to civil programs is still bigger than the total mass deployed in space on behalf of military programs. And the reason for that is that civil programs, which also include human space flight, are usually on a mass to cost ratio less expensive than military programs. Military programs are really rolling out exquisite technologies. The military are really paying a lot more to actually roll out infrastructure in space, which result in these different bias. On the other hand, what you notice as well is that the global investment in terms of tons deployed in space on behalf of military programs is also growing. This is another major trend. So two main trends been identified: more human space flight, more remote sensing, translating into more mass deployed on behalf of military programs. Those are two very important trends in recent years, of course, which can be measured when you put Starlink on the side. When you look also at the elements of split of the demand for those institutional programs, and you eliminate the mass of a human space flight, which really represent a lot of mass by themselves, and you look at the different trends between civil institutional programs and what I will show later on, military institutional programs, we notice that in 2024, globally speaking, there has been a massive growth of the tons deployed in orbit on behalf of civil institutional programs. And one of the key drivers of that growth, if you look at the bottom of the chart here, you will see that China in light brown is actually the #1 explanation for the growth of civil institutional programs worldwide. This is also a trend that we have highlighted already a couple of years ago. China has become one of the most important players in the global space scene. This is really an important point. In 2024, we see a noticeable spike in Chinese deployments in orbit. When you look at the military institutional programs, again, you look at the customer region split, and here you see a very big difference between the chart on the left and the chart on the right, is that you can see much less colors. And when you look at the investment made in military institutional programs, assessed here in mass, the main information I want you to keep in mind is that today, beyond China, the USA, and to a lesser extent, Russia, all other space powers are really not investing the military space. They are really falling back all the others. And when you look also at the massive growth trend, which is clearly visible on military institutional programs, and you look at the important spike which is associated to the US deployment of the Starshield system in 2024, you can really see that this is a new war domain. And this is really a massive area of investment for government programs every year, and it is really growing. And again, you can notice the important growth in brown here of the Chinese space program and the investment that the Chinese are doing in increasing their military space capabilities. This is something where at European level, we are really falling way, way, way behind. And you can notice that the European investment in military space in orange in the charts here is barely visible. We are not doing our role. We are not keeping the place of Europe in the geopolitical space sensibly at the level of military investment. This will be changing. We know that IRIS² is coming up, and this is a major opportunity for Europe to play a more important role. We see that we have a number of proposals to actually step up the importance of Europe and the capacity of Europe to actually monitor space for military applications, to actually look at the Earth, to actually improve our tactical communication capabilities. But we have a very big gap, and it will not be filled in very easily. And here we see another representation, which I believe is also very interesting in terms of assessing European space policy and the way we're approaching it. This is the total demand for launch services on behalf of institutional programs only, region by region. And for every histogram here, we have split it in two so that you have the demand which is served by domestic launchers, which are launch services provided by launchers which are built domestically, and the demand which is served by using launchers which are not built in the region of the demand. And here you see a few very important points. You see first that in the USA, the global launch demand for institutional programs is absolutely huge. It has been receding in value, and you can see that there were very big histograms, up to 7 billion in one single year of launch demand from the US, but this is due to the fact that they were using the space shuttle, which is, a launcher which has been extremely expensive. But in recent years, you notice that the demand, the institutional domestic demand from the US institutions to procure launch is between $2 and $3 billion a year. This is the demand which is only accessible to US launch providers. If you look at China, you can see how the growth of China is clearly visible and how China in 20 years has passed from being a low-key player in space, if you look at the histogram in 2005, to something which is now matching the importance of the USA in terms of institutional launch demand, which is just a reflection of the importance of the Chinese space program. And here very clearly you see that the Chinese launch demand, measured in purchasing power parities, is on a match with the US one, which is 2 to 3 billion a year, sometimes even close to 4. In contrast, you can see that some space powers like Europe, India, Japan, and of course all the other countries in the world are playing a much lesser game. In Europe, we see that the institutional launch demand is plateauing between $300 and $500 million a year. But what is most striking with the European situation is that a small fraction of that demand has been served by European launchers. Europe is not able or willing to enforce for its institutional program a real European preference for the launch. And this is creating a gap of demand for for European space launchers, which are not served with the same type of captive demand that the US and Chinese counterparts are actually being served, which is creating a competition gap. And this is only looking at the demand for institutional programs, the one for which we can have the political will to make sure that it will only be served by European launchers. Of course, Europe has suffered from a gap in launch supply in the past 2 years, but this is not the case anymore, and we can only expect now that with the range of launch services available in Europe, with the actual Vega for medium launch, Ariane for a heavy launch, and we see also now with the European Launcher Challenge and what France 2030 has been doing, we see also the emergence of very small launchers in Europe, hopefully all operational by the end of 2026. There will be normally in Europe a sufficient level of offer and supply to actually support all the European launch needs. So we are advocating for that, for European institutional programs to make systematic recourse to European launchers like the US are doing, like the Chinese are doing, and like, to a lesser extent, what India, Japanese, and the Russians are doing as well. So Europe here is really an exception in the launch preference policy, and we really want to see this improve because this is one of the key points to achieving better competitiveness for European space launch supplier. When you look at the trends in commercial space programs, here you see the comparison of the total mass launch to space on behalf of commercial programs when you separate Starlink from the rest in order to be able to see the difference between Starlink and the other programs. Of course, you see that Starlink is really crushing the statistics here. The total mass deployed in space by Starlink is absolutely no match for all the others. This is really something they're way ahead. But this is because they have this very specific business model, which is developing in LEO to serve mass market applications. But when you translate this in terms of cost of acquisition for the space infrastructure, you see that clearly Starlink, and this is the recipe of success of the Starlink constellation, to be extremely cheap to produce and launch, which makes it a very, relatively speaking, small investment. You can see the evolution on the side of the other programs and the commercial demand. And you see that there is a cyclical component, and you see that in 2024, this demand has been, again, growing a little bit. However, we must note that in this commercial program demand, there is a few very specific points. In particular, we count in the 2024 figure the Worldview Legion program, which has been rolled out by MAXA, which is indeed a privately funded program, but the final demand for the services are actually governmental. And then we also included here, and this is why the US part is quite big, we also included here a few hundred millions on behalf of the Polaris mission, which was, you know, this privately funded human space flight, which are impacting a little bit on those figures and changing a little bit the phenomenon, because typically, commercial space programs were limited to one single set of applications, as I showed before, which was really very much linked to communication systems. And this is the trend we have today in geostationary communications, where the demand is actually decreasing. When you look at the launch demand for commercial programs, of course, this is a subset of the demand for satellites. So you can see here that in terms of commercial programs, the launch demand measured in tons at launch was below 10,000 tons in the year. And then when you look at the market value for commercial launch, you can see that every year it is topping at a maximum of 1.8 billion in the year. So this is the total launch demand on behalf of commercial programs. And you look here that in terms of customers, the commercial customers which are acquiring launch, and of course, which are the same ones which are acquiring satellite, are mostly European in orange and American in light gray. You can see that China has small, slowly maturing commercial demand for launch services as well. And you can see that there are, of course, commercial demand from other players. We think about Latin America and Asian countries which don't have domestic capabilities to launch. But clearly, you can see that the market for commercial programs and the associated launch service is quite small. Again, in the total demand for launch services, which is about 14 billion in 2024, the commercial share of that is less than 2. So it's really a small fraction of the actual demand. And this has been a major point of revenue for Arianespace in the past. So we don't know what will be the potential for this market segment to still provide opportunity for the European launch operator. So let's have a look at this decreasing situation in the geostationary commercial program segment. So this has been, since the end of the 80s, the #1 application for commercial space, launching satellites to geo and operating them for 15 to 20 years. This has been the #1 point of competitiveness of the European space industry, which has really grown a lot on this specific market segment. Here you see our rendering of the geo-commercial orders by year. I'm putting commercial in small brackets here because this includes also the orders from public satellite operators such as Arabsat and Thuraya and others like that, which are indeed government-owned, but they participate in this global market demand with the other commercial operators. So they're bundled here. You can see that there is less and less demand for geostationary satellites. And measured in total mass, you can see that we have came from a situation where every year we would be registering orders with up to 100 and more than 100 tons a year. In 2024, the total orders added up to less than 20 tons. You can see that Europe has been very, very good in actually capturing market shares. And in the context of a receding demand, European players have actually increased the share of orders that they captured. On the other hand, when the demand is receding, there are no miracles. And even if you capture most of the demand which is available on the market, of course, your business will be decreasing. And indeed, when you measure that in $1 billion launched every year, you can see that after very big years where the global market for geostationary satellite represented up to 4 and 5, and you can see in 2017 almost 7 billion a year at launch, you can see that in 2024 this is plateauing around 3 billion. And when you look here, you see that the European share of that is quite small. So this is the current situation with this very specific segment of the commercial market, which has been, as I said, a very important segment for the European industry, because the European industry was very well placed in building those large geostationary satellites for those commercial customers, such as Eutelsat, Inmarsat, and the others. And Europe was also very strongly invested in the business of launching these satellites. This was very, very important, and this was one of the staples of the Arianespace business. And Ariane 5 has been, after Ariane 4, one of the main launchers to go to geostationary orbit for commercial operators. So I'll make a small break here to enable a few questions on this first part of the presentation. Charles, you will let me know if there is anybody raising their hands, please.
So far, no hands raised.
So please, the question? No hands raised. Sorry for that.
We have a question from Georg.
Oh, Georg, please.
Yeah, Pierre, thank you for the last slide, especially because mainly, as you said, you use your launch database. So that's really actual launch date going into your statistics. But on the last slide, you on the left side, you said it's the order date. It's not the launch date here.
Absolutely. This is the order. So basically, since it takes 24 to 48 months from order to launch, and sometimes more, because sometimes satellites are ordered in batches of 2 and 3, which will be launched across 2 to 3 years. So yes, you can imagine that, you know, the figure we see for 2024 is actually, in terms of actual launch, a composite of the demand and the orders that were secured sometime between 2019 and 2022.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's very difficult to get this matched. Also, on the left-hand side, we are producing those elements, these orders, which are in tonnage, because it's easy to estimate the actual tonnage of an order, while it's very difficult to get the actual value of it. But once the satellite is launched, we can actually source better the value, and we do a better work at assessing it.
Okay, yeah, and you cannot directly compare these two graphs, because
yes,
I stumbled over it first, but the other one is also by a customer region and not by the supplier.
Absolutely,
So
absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
But again, it's interesting to see how those play out, because indeed the orders will mostly translate into launch at some point in time, despite the fact that we see also orders being cancelled due to the fact that there has been a lot of mergers and acquisition happening in the geostationary operator space. And clearly, when those mergers and acquisitions happen, it's a way also for them to streamline their infrastructure demand. And some orders are delayed and sometimes cancelled. So this is also something which is really a strong trend in recent years.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And Pierre, there's a question from Christophe Morin from the European Commission.
Please, thank you.
Good morning to all, and many thanks for this very interesting presentation. You have stressed, in fact, the impact of Starlink, but I have a question. Would it be possible in your analysis to take out from your figures, in fact, Starlink, the business also Starshield and SpaceX, to have a kind of overview and assessment on the evolution of the business if you take out in fact SpaceX from the equation, and to see also the positioning of SpaceX as a kind of monopoly in many domains.
Yes, we can absolutely do that. I think that we do it systematically for commercial programs, because Starlink is actually playing a very specific game into this commercial domain, because indeed they are not procuring satellites. This has been a big change, you know, the integrated approach, where they're actually building their own satellites, launching them themselves, and then making the operations. You know, Stéphane Israël a couple of years back was saying the specificity of SpaceX is that it is competing with everyone in the space supply chain, from the manufacturing, the launch, and the operations. So we do that. Of course, we could also separate SpaceX from the government programs approach, but here I believe the situation from the market perspective is a bit different, because indeed SpaceX can be a very tough competitor, but in terms of institutional demand, they're really competing with the others like anyone else. It's not, their reserve domain. So they're very good at it. And indeed, the Starship constellation appeared very significantly in our data. You remember I was highlighting the spike in growth in the launch for military institutional programs in the USA. Most of that in 2024 is actually part of the Starship constellation, because they played, if I remember well, like 240 satellites on behalf of that. So take this with a grain of salt. I'm not sure with the figures from the top of my head, but this is the order of magnitude. So on the other hand, I would like to recall that we had organized a while ago a webinar exclusively focusing on trying to decrypt what SpaceX is doing. And if there is additional demand, we can set it up again. So we would be very happy to present also the main findings we have on SpaceX, which is indeed a very peculiar and unique player on the space scene today. So if there are no more questions, I can move to the second part of the presentation, which will be much faster, which is dealing with our analysis of European space budgets. So the European space budget is something which is measured by a number of different entities. We at Eurospace, we are focusing on measuring the part of the European institutional investment in space programs, which is actually funding what we usually call the upstream, which is the development of satellites, their launch, and potentially their operations. When you look, for instance, at the annual Novaspace rendering of global space budgets, you will see that the figures would be bigger, because in terms of institutional commitment to space programs, you will also find a lot of funding which is eventually not going to developing space infrastructure, which is also space inspired. For instance, you will see funding for large ground telescopes, and this has been a very important point of investment for a number of European international countries. But of course, this money is not going to building space infrastructure and launching it, so we are putting it on the side. So we're not saying this money does not exist. We are saying that this is money that is not going to fund space programs in the sense of activities which are eventually flying to orbit. Also, you will see in a number of European and international space budget assessments that there is a lot of money which is going to funding research in space science, such as the important amounts that the German authorities are putting into the DLR institutes. Again, this money is not eventually funding space programs, so we are not counting that. So our measure of the activity is really focusing on the upstream. So again, this we believe is the share of the European space budgets, which is eventually available to support the development of space programs, systems, and their launch and operations. So again, our specific focus on this measure is very much a matter of definitions to understand how this can be compared with other elements. So we believe that in 2024, the total European space budgets going to the funding of space programs and related activities was in the order of 11.4 billion euro. Most of that amount was actually funded by national will. 9.4 of this total was actually driven by national investment in programs, either through national programs managed nationally, or also invested through ESA. And an additional 2 billion was actually funded through the European Union budget process, which is actually the money which is going to Galileo, Copernicus, etc. This amount does not include also the large funds made available by the European Union to actually support the operations of those systems, and should not include as well the money which is going to the market development activities. So 11.4 billion, mostly driven by national space budgets and the EU space budget to a lesser extent. You can see on the right-hand side how this money is eventually managed by the different entities which are managing those space programs. And you can see that the European Space Agency is managing most of it with 7.5 billion of managed budget. The second entities managing this budget were national entities such as CNES, the DLR, the UKSA, the Italian Space Agency, which I should have mentioned first because now it's really playing an important role. So these national entities are managing 2.3 billion of those programs. Then there are the military programs, which are sometimes managed by the space agencies, but mostly they're managed by military entities like the French DGA or the Bundeswehr in Germany. Those managed about 1.1 billion in military space budgets. And here you can really see the difference. I mean, the equivalent figure for the Americans would be around $52 billion managed every year for military space programs. In Europe, we are putting 1.1. Okay, of course, the perimeter is not exactly the same. The military are funding the GPS. In the US, they're funding the GPS with military budget. In Europe, we are funding the GPS with a civilian budget, which is eventually managed by ESA. It's called Galileo. But still, the gap, the difference is absolutely huge. So ESA is the #1 entity for managing European institutional space programs by far. It is managing 7.5 billion euro worth of programs every year. When we look at the evolution over time, and this is what I was saying in my small introductory remark, we see that the European space budget is actually growing significantly in the past 10 years. We see that we have more commitment from European governments in yellow and from the EU space budget in gray. We have growing commitment to space programs. And, you know, as the main advocacy representative association of the European space sector, we are really very happy to see this trend. This is really a major trend of recent years. We see that we are committing more to those European space programs, and this is really helping Europe grow into the global space scene. This is a very, very positive point, and really the interest of governments in space programs is improving. But as I said, the gap with our main partners and competitors, which are the USA, China, and Russia, is still quite huge, and we need to keep going with this trend. We see that in terms of national interest for space programs, there are small and large space countries in Europe, and you can see that France is actually investing much more than anyone else in European space programs at large, following by Germany and Italy. And with these three countries together, we have most of the investment made in the European space budgets. Of course, smaller countries are also contributing to the European space programs the best they can, but of course, they represent a much lesser investment overall. So I will make a brief stop here also if you have any questions on this European space budget scene, and then I will move to the last part of the presentation, which is the results of the annual Eurospace Facts and Figures survey. So apparently I can move on, so let me proceed. Oh, Dampierre, you have raised your hand.
Yes, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Yes, yeah, thanks for the presentation. Just one clarification here. Pierre, did I understood well that in these figures you do not include R&D?
No, we do include the R&D, such, you know, the programs like GSTP, TDE, also, you know, the preparatory activity for Copernicus, etc. So all this is included. What we don't include is the direct manpower support that is going to such institutes as the DLR or ONERA. So this is a very different thing, which is probably low TRL R&D. So this is separated in the budget analysis. But that's the only portion. Everything which goes into R&D funding for the European space industry is actually counted and kept into the budget. So if you wish, we can also, we have a general presentation on European space budget where we explain our methodology with quite some detail so that we show what we separate from the national investment in space programs, which are usually reported, such as the DLR, which is very transparent on their website on where they invest money, but we really keep only the share which is actually going to fund activities within the European space industry. That's our focus. Again, we need to understand that we do those measures for our members solely and principally. So the interest for us is trying to delineate for our members what is the actual market opportunity for them.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But I mean, one can argue that low TRL activities are contributing on future development, and
Absolutely.
so taking it out could be. I mean, this could be argued to.
It is, and indeed, I'm perfectly okay with this, Jean-Pierre. My point again, as I said at the beginning, is that this is a measure from an economic point of view, trying to give the people which are building satellites and launcher the opportunity to understand what would be the market accessibility they have on behalf of those budgets. So this is why we have this specific angle, and I'm very clear on that this is our own angle, and I believe that it's interesting for the people who are into the business of building satellites and launching them and developing them. So you see, I'm not saying that other measures are wrong, I'm just saying that we are doing one which is very specifically targeted at understanding the market opportunity those budgets provide for the people who are developing and building satellites.
Mm-hmm.
You see, and again, your comment is perfectly valid. And this is why I insisted at the beginning that we have a specific definition, and I explaining why this definition is built that way and why it is giving those results.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Again, we really insist a lot on our data presentation that people understand how this sits in the global context of understanding how the space sector is faring overall. So we are trying to be as clear as we can with the type of presentation we make and with the definition of what our numbers include or do not include. Thank you. So I will move to the last part of the presentation where I'm indeed showing the outcome of the Eurospace Facts and Figures survey. So this is a survey that we do every year now since 1996. I was doing it already in 1986, so clearly you see that I have a long history with this one. And again, to prolong what I was saying in my remarks and answers to Jean-Pierre's question, in this survey, we are asking the European space companies, which are building satellites, which are producing engineering to develop the satellites, which are building the launchers, which are operating those activities. We are asking them how they were faring in the year. We are asking them to give us the details of the revenues they clocked in the year, and we are asking them to tell us how many people were working to produce those revenues in the year. And the budget analysis we are making is indeed in parallel with this one. So clearly, the budgets that we are measuring and assessing are actually the ones which are giving the opportunity for those people to actually make those revenues. So this is also why we keep the consistency of the approach throughout our data set, trying to understand indeed how the market opportunities arise from those European space institutional budgets to actually translate into space industry revenues in the production of space systems. So our survey, as I said, is tracking revenues measured as final sales and employment. So here you see the global figure with more than 30 years of statistics that we have accumulated in the past. With the recent trend, of course, in 2024, we see that the sales are actually rebounding a little bit. So you can notice that we are growing a little bit. The final sales in 2024 up to 8.8 billion euro. And you can see the constant growth of employment, which has accompanied the development of the space industry up to 66,000 employees, which are full-time employees working in the European space industrial sector. And the most striking point here is that you can see the blue curve of employment, which has been constantly growing since 2009. This actually 2008. This has been a constant additional flow of capacity in terms of more employees in the space sector. On the other hand, you see that after 2017, the revenues of the sector have not grown at the same rate. We have noticed that in 2020, we had a very bad year. That was the COVID year, which has many, many reasons for the industry to clock in less sales. In 2021, industry recouped, and managed to register more revenues. But since 2021, we see that industry revenues are not growing at the same rate of employment. So I will get into some more details at the end of the presentation about productivity, which is actually the ratio between the sales and the employees, or how much each employee is capable to bring to the revenue of the company he works for or she works for. And clearly we see here that this is a major point of concern as an economist, that we see that employment is growing without significant improvement of the total business of the companies, which means that companies are not making enough money to pay all the salaries, globally speaking, at sector level. This is something that I will detail further on. So in terms of employment, we have a lot of interesting measures that I'm sharing with you today. So as I said, 66,000 people are employed. And interestingly, we note that we have different categories of companies employing those people. First, what I call the large four, which are the different space units which are embedded in 4 large industrial conglomerates, which are Airbus, Thales, Leonardo, and Safran. Those 4 large groups provide 46% of the total employment in the European space industrial sector in 2024. This share is receding. We will see this later on. It is receding because these guys, after many, many years of employment growth, are now letting off people in quite a significant way. But they're also receding in share because one other fraction of the sector is actually growing, and I will tell you more about that. The other large group, which are other companies which have more than 10,000 employees worldwide, they represent 6% of the employment in those other large groups. For instance, I would like to mention a company like Air Liquide, which is a member of Eurospace. It is a very large industrial player, but with smaller industrial space capabilities than the large four. Then we have the mid-cap segment. So one little nod to the ESA colleagues. What we call a mid-cap is the industrial definition of a mid-cap. So in this case, it is every company which has less than 10,000 employees, globally speaking, and which is in this segment a pure player in space. So in this mid-cap segment, for instance, we will count companies like GMV, like Sapka, like Sener, but also like OHB and Avio, which are smaller players than the large four. Those mid-caps, they represent 26% of the total space employment, and they are a growing employment segment in the sector. Then we have legacy SMEs, which represent 6%. I call them legacy because those SMEs exist on the panorama for quite a while. They're mostly equipment suppliers, and they've been sitting in our survey for a while. And we separate them from the emerging segment of space startups, despite the fact that most of those startups are still SMEs today. But we separate them because they have different growth dynamics. So you see how the total employment is split. Of course, we can actually show the way those employment are split among corporate entities. The rule for this pie chart here is that every company which has more than 1,000 full-time employees in space can actually appear separately in this graph. And we are so proud to see that all the big players are indeed members of Eurospace. Thank you for supporting us. Really, we're very much welcome here. But we see that Airbus is the #1 employer in the space segment today with the various entities, followed by Thales Alenia Space and Ariane Group. And then we see the other ones spreading up: Telespazio, Safran, OHB, Beyond Gravity, GMV, and Avio, of course. And all the other companies in the sector, they represent 45% of total employment. And here you can see how those employments are spread across countries, and you can see how this capability chart mimics the one on European space budgets, and you see how important those European space budgets have been and still are into shaping the capabilities of the European space sector, because you can see that most of the employment is actually present in France, where the presence of the large four players is absolutely among us. They represent 70% or 80% of the total employment of the French space industry. On the other hand, you see that smaller players like Germany, Italy, Spain, the UK, to a lesser extent Belgium, Sweden, Switzerland, the Netherlands, they have different employment structure where the presence of the four large players are not that important in comparison to other typologies of industries, such as the mid-caps or, to a lesser extent, the startups. When you look at the dynamic of the growth of employment in those 5 different industry segments, you can see 2 very important trends that I would like to highlight at this point. The first one is the growth of employment in the mid-cap segment, which I recall is an independent company which is larger than an SME and is not yet a large group, and we put the bar at 10,000 employees globally speaking. And really this mid-cap segment has been really growing a lot in the past 15 years, as presented on this chart. You could see that in the large 4 group, there has been a lot of growth in recent years, but due to the difficulties that these groups are facing today, specifically in front of the receding commercial market, we see that now they are letting go quite a number of people, and you can see this with the decreasing numbers. And the other very important growth factor in employment that we've registered in recent years is the major growth that is happening in those startup environment. Those again are young companies, still often without a mature product, although some of them have. So again, we cannot generalize all of it, but still we see that this has been a major provider of employment in the space industry. It's more than 10,000 people now in 2024, representing, as I said, 16% of the total employment in the European space sector so far. But with this very, very quick growth, there is a lot to be asked about the long-term viability of all of them. Again, I'm always very worried with this specific segment of the industry because without sufficient market opportunity, they may have difficulties in the future. But we know that market opportunities are a problem also for the large groups, which, as I said, were very much exposed to the commercial market. So this is a very specific point I wanted to address at this point. When we compare now, this chart is showing the evolution of the revenues of the industry, looking at the 2 main market segments that we identify. In brown, we see how European space industry are taking opportunity out of the institutional programs. So these are the revenues produced by the spending of ESA, of the Union, of EUMETSAT, but also of national programs managed by CNES, DLR, UKSA, ASI, and the others. And as I noted previously, with the exception of the hiccup in 2020 due to the COVID, we have registered growing revenues with institutional programs, which is actually very consistent with the chart I was showing to you previously, which was highlighting the growth of European government investment in space programs in the past 15 years. So clearly those 2 things are correlated, and it is very important to note that indeed European institutional programs, they represent a major revenue opportunities for the European space industry. And in orange, you can see the evolution of the commercial and export revenues, which include satellite exports, of course, the exports of satellite and other space equipment, but it also includes the activity associated to producing operational launcher elements for launch activities managed by Arianespace in the past. And now they will be managed by 2025 by Arianespace and ELV. So you can see that this orange curve has been really fluctuating a lot. And you can see that in the late 90s, there has been, geostationary commercial satellite cycle, which has influenced the figures. And you can see that since 2017, the European space industry has lost about 1 billion euro in total revenues associated to, actually even two, associated to those commercial programs. This is a major point of concern, and this is one of the main reasons, not the only one, why the industry is not doing so well in recent years. And this is really affecting the most those companies which are associated to those geostationary commercial programs. So clearly Airbus and Thales Alenia Space are really facing a lot of those revenue opportunities reductions, but it is also affecting to a lesser extent, but still significantly, the companies which are involved in the operational Ariane launcher program activities, because indeed the Ariane system has been very heavily exposed to the commercial geostationary launch demand. And so of course, this is also affecting these companies. When you look at the histogram presentation of the sales by main customer segment, here without going into the details, I want to highlight how much the European Space Agency programs, which are here presented in very deep blue, it is the largest histogram you can see on this slide, how they have really been playing a formative role on the revenues of the European space industry. This is really the #1 customer for the European space industry, and it is increasingly so due to the fact that they're also managing a lot of the European Union programs, okay? Despite the fact that here we are trying to separate the revenue opportunities provided by the European Union and EUMETSAT and the others. You can see in brown the disturbing evolution of the demand from European commercial programs, which is really dropping quite significantly. And this is really absolutely one of the major trends we have seen in the European space market segment for the European space industry. Of course, you see that national military programs in yellow are actually growing. And this again is a point of interest and satisfaction for the industry. But again, as I said before, we are still very far away from the business opportunity which military programs are actually offering to our US and Chinese competitors. Here you see a 30-year rendering of the evolution of the main segments by product. So we separate satellite applications, which include all operational systems for observation, communications, navigation, mixing up commercial, of course, and institutional programs, which represent about 5 billion euro in revenue opportunity for the European space industry in recent years. So you see that there has been a few erratic changes in the years, but the overall level is between 4.5 and 5 billion. So we are really strong on producing operational satellites for practical applications. And then you see that there are three now product segments which are faring about at the same level, 1.4, 1.5 billion euro, which are applicable to the scientific system demand. So this includes most of those activities which are managed through ESA scientific programs, of course, but also exploration activity, which is here in the green. You see that the launcher systems in yellow is actually also offering opportunities for about 1.4 billion euro to the European space industry. And then what we call support activities, which includes a lot of services such as engineering services, R&D services, and also it includes the development of a ground segment and related operational control centers. So those are the split in terms of business segments. Most of the activities, as I said, is driven by the development and production of operational satellite applications. Here we see the split by main products, and we can see in terms of applications, we are differentiating between telecommunication systems, which have represented until 2017 in brown here, the main revenue opportunity for the industry, actually spreading all the way to 2022. They are now overtaken by Earth observation systems, which at almost 1.8 billion revenue in opportunity, they're now surpassed telecommunications applications in terms of revenue for the industry. You could see also in green the profile of evolution of launcher revenues, which are now about 1.3, 1.4 billion in a year. And hopefully this will grow again with Ariane and Vega activity ramping up in coming years. So we look forward for this revenue point to increase. And then, of course, you can see the steady revenue provided by ground station development. You see in this deep beige here, which is really representing an important opportunity, including what we count as professional services, which is the development of engineering services and different operational activities which are carried out by the private sector, mostly for agencies, but not only. They're also providing those engineering and professional services to the industry at large. So let's have a look now at what we could call the industry segment dynamics. And here I'm sharing with you a few slides which are showing the different total sales and employment dynamics of those industry segments which I was presenting at the beginning of my presentation. Here you will see the evolution of total sales, looking at the four main sales segments for the large groups. I mean, all the companies which have more than 10,000 employees overall, not only in space. And you see the four main revenue segments they have. They are selling to European institutional customers here in very deep blue. They're also selling to European commercial customers, said company like Eutelsat, for instance, but also the sales to Arianespace, which are in lighter blue. The customers at expert level, the rest of the world customers, which are here in green, and then what we call intersector sales, which is the exchanges that companies do between themselves, you know, acquiring equipment and then integrating them in subsystems. So this is intersector sales, which is a large area of business, which is usually consolidated, so counted separately. So you can see here that for the large groups, there has been a clear trend since 2017 of globally receding sales, which has been very much influenced by receding sales in experts, in green, and for European commercial customers. This has been the major trend in recent years. And this trend now is causing this little receding value of employment that is measured in the red curve here. So after years of receding sales, despite the fact that the order books are very much filled for those companies, they need to let go a number of people. And we have now, we have seen announcements of more employment reductions in the large groups that will further through in 2025 and 2026. So now they are reshaping their capabilities to address this structural receding demand. When we look at the evolution of the mid-caps, as I said, those mid-caps are the industrial definition of mid-caps. They include every independent company which is smaller than 10,000 people overall, and it includes such players as GMV, Sapka, Sener, and also Avio and OHB. Okay, we can see that the mid-caps have been actually faring much better. One of the reasons is that they were less exposed to the European commercial business, and they're still doing good on the expert domain, but most strikingly we see that they are very much improving their market share on behalf of the European institutional demand. And we see that for them, the employment evolution is tracking the evolution of the total sales, which shows that they are in a more healthy environment from, you know, basic economic analysis. And from that point of view, they are still growing and they're not letting go anyone. When we look at the evolution also of the business of what we call the legacy SMEs, again, those are not startups, those are those companies that have a long-standing participation in programs. Usually they're active in a number of very specific application segments, such as producing engineering services or machine parts or electronic equipment. Those SMEs globally in our survey are doing quite well. We can see that, of course, they are mostly active in producing in the intersector domain because they are not selling directly to final customers, although their share of the the business with European institutional customers accessing such programs as the GSTP and the R&D support programs of ESA, but also at national level, are creating also for those SMEs a rather healthy economic environment where employment growth is supported by the growth of sales. And we can see also for the startup, so I would like to take for everyone to take those figures with a grain of salt, because this is really very much an analysis that we do building on open source data. Startups are not very much participating to our survey. I like to say, hopefully not yet, but they're very secretive on their revenues. But we have a lot of open source information that we can actually get to produce those assessments. So take those with a grain of salt, which are estimates. With the startups, we can actually see that the very rapid growth of employment, the red curve, is also supported by an important growth of sales overall. So clearly, these guys are doing better and better. They are more mature. They have mature products. They have sales opportunities with European institutional programs, but also with European commercial customers. They're also doing business one with the other, which is interesting. And they're also exporting quite a lot, all things, kept to the right dimension. So clearly, this is an environment where we see them growing sales and growing employment. But on the other hand, when we look at the productivity level of those different segments, I would like to raise a few warnings. Because you can see already that depending on whether you're a large group, a mid-cap, an SME, or a startup, your level of apparent worker productivity, which is the ratio between sales and employment, is very different. And the key point here that we see is that today in the startup environment, there is not yet sufficient revenue per employee to support the business by itself. This is a general trend. I believe that there are a few European startups which are doing quite well and which can actually match with revenues the employment they have. And this is very obvious when we see that some of them have been in existence for quite a while with very limited recourse to equity raises. For instance, Anywaves would be an example of that. Okay, clearly we have those startups, but on the other hand, the very low average level of productivity, which is in the order of 60,000 euro per employee in the startup environment, I believe it is not sustainable in the long term without more equity raises. When you look at the SMEs, they are in the order of 120k euro of average turnover per employee. I believe that this could be sustainable in the context of activities which are not too heavy on capital. So if you don't have too much to invest on capital, this is a manageable productivity level, which makes, I believe, sense and provides to a healthy economic environment for space sector SMEs. Then you move up in the value chain, and you see mid-caps, but a lot of those mid-caps are actually doing prime level activity. So this is why the apparent productivity per employee is much higher at more than 2,000 euro per employees. And you can see that in the mid-caps, this productivity is actually growing in recent years, which is really a good show of the strengths they're showing on the European space segment. And again, at about 200,000 euro per employee, globally, they may provide a healthy environment from an economic standpoint for further growth. On the other hand, and this is, I believe, is one of the crises we are seeing in the large groups, we see that the level of productivity per employee is still high, which is normal because, most of the activity they're doing as prime, so they're integrating in the value chain a lot of the acquisitions they're making. And so they're integrating productivity provided and value added provided by the second and third tier suppliers. But on the other hand, there is a worrying trend of actually decreasing productivity, which has reached a very low point in 2023 and 2024, which is not as high as the almost 350,000 euro per employee that was registered in 2016. And I think that this is one of the reasons why we see the sector moving prudently, I would say, towards the future, because the fundamentals I was saying at the beginning are not exceptionally good. And when I say this, I'm being using overtones, undertones in expression. And so this may explain why I'm showing you this very last slide, and this will be the end of the presentation. At Eurospace level, we have organized a specific survey with our members on the actual profit level generated by their space business. And today, the picture that we are drawing is not very good. So this is not yet updated to 2024, because in order to be able to collect this data, we need to access the most recent accounts. So this is not available, but I am updating it already for 2024. But what you can see here on the left-hand side, we have two curves. The yellow curve is the average company profit rate. So basically, we take every company, disregarding of their size, and we look at what is the ratio between earnings before interest and tax, which is very close to the profit on operations, and their sales. And then we do an average of that percentage. So this is disconnected from the size of the companies. And you can see that overall, for all the companies we had in the sample of our survey, every one of them is seeing receding profit rates. This is a general trend in the European space industry. And I would like to add also, we've looked at the US counterparts, and this is happening in the USA as well. It is not as profitable as it was in the past to do space activity. But what is most striking is that when you do the same analysis, and this is the brown curve, and you add the size of the revenues of the company, and you factor in the total profit, you can see that globally in 2023, the space sector is very much into negative profit territory. And this is really a serious problem for the future of the sector. And of course, you can always say, well, yes, but that's only a few large players which are affected. And as I could show you before, at the level of the mid-caps, this is not very visible. But when you consider that those large players are actually the market makers for many others, then there is some concern to be had with the health of the global sector. Also, in terms of industrial policy, and you're looking at space policy at large, I believe that this profitability issue is something that needs to be looked into with very serious attention. Of course, we know that we have a dialogue with ESA at that level, and we have really a very good dialogue on this point, but this is a serious issue. On the right-hand side, you can see how big is our sample for this analysis, which is quite representative with, for the year 2019, almost 7 billion euro in the total clocking elements. In 2023, it's a bit smaller, but we believe it's still quite representative of the sector at large. And you can see that today, globally speaking, in 2023, the total profit generated by the space sector in Europe was negative. Again, some companies are doing better than others, and really hats off to them, but some companies are really in a very difficult situation, and this is concerning for the sector as a whole. So I'm sorry to close the presentation with these concerning points, but we believe that this was also something important to be noted at this point. Again, one of the reasons why those profits are receding is the general trend that we have seen with commercial programs overall, but this is not the only reason. The people at the ESA industrial policy, with which we have this open dialogue on profitability on space programs, they know very well what we're talking about here. So this is clearly an issue. On the other hand, I would like to close the morning by saying that indeed the industry is doing better in 2024 than it was doing in 2023 in terms of total revenues, total sales, and total employment. We are very happy to see that space is still a strong power of attraction. A lot of people are coming to work for the sector. So this is really something which is interesting to note, and shows that we are still an attractive sector for people who want to work on challenging programs. On the other hand, I would really like to recall that there are a number of concerning facts. Some segments of the industry are doing better, and indeed the mid-caps, the SMEs, they're really growing well, and we're very happy for those. But looking at the situation of large groups, there is some concern. So the future will tell us what this consolidation, restructuration will do, and hopefully it will help the industry to start up again with more competitiveness, more flexibility, more capabilities. So the presentation is done. We're still now a lot of time open for floor questions. So I'm ready and available, but I will stop the presentation at this point. Thank you very much for your attention. So we have a question from Charlotte Van Kamp.
Yes, good morning or good afternoon in the meantime. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's really, you demonstrated really interesting figures. I actually, there were some questions that I had, and most of them actually already addressed by continuing the presentation, but I was wondering if you could go back to slide 21.
Let me share again. Yes, of course. Oh, share. So the slide 21, let's go. Hold on, I need to go back. There we go. This is the one, right?
Yes, this is the one, yes, where you actually draw the comparison about production activities decreasing, and when you mentioned that revenues are not growing, employment has grown. But you mentioned that a lot of these revenues are also coming from the big four, as you call them, right? And so I was wondering, it would be interesting, and this is just me thinking out loud as well, to sort of draw a comparison between the number of employments of the big four companies and then the mid caps and the SMEs companies, because other analysis that I came across has demonstrated that basically the two don't necessarily go hand in hand, that because of revenues are growing and employment has not grown, that it immediately means that the productivity levels have decreased, but that it could depend as well, or that there are other factors basically having a role or an impact on this. So I was just wondering at what if you actually also draw comparisons between the employment levels in those larger companies.
Actually, I did. So we have this slide here, which is showing the evolution of employment with the different segments. But more interestingly, those are exactly the ones you are asking about. You see here we have the large groups, and you can see the employment on top. This is the red curve. And you can see here the accumulated revenues. And indeed, as I was mentioning before, we have different evolution trends. So the large groups are indeed facing receding revenues while still having growing employment until 2023, and they're just now addressing the reduction of employment. But you can see for the mid caps, you can see that this is a general trend of growth, which is actually parallel, employment and revenues. And this is the case also for the SMEs, and also the case for the startups. So indeed, yes, we are addressing this, and indeed we see that this is not a general point. Okay, indeed there are differences between the various industrial segments that we recognize in our analysis. Yes.
All right, thanks for clarifying. And on slide 22 as well, you showed a chart, I think on the right, with the SMEs and the mid caps are growing. Wait, no, sorry, slide 23, I think it was.
Yes. This is the one, I guess.
Wait, no, I'm sorry, I'm looking at my notes. I took some notes. There was a chart that you showed on the commercial and the export markets as well.
Yes, we have the ones on revenue. So we have this one, which is actually looking at the two main segments, which is institutional Europe on the top in brown, and the commercial and experts at the bottom in orange or yellow, whatever you want to call it. This is the one, or maybe, yes, okay.
One I had a question about it. Apologies for the background noise. My neighbors were working. I was wondering if you also had a look at why these commercial and exports line has been fluctuating so much over time.
Well, again, so the fluctuation. So when we looked at the, there is a growth in the early 90s, and then there is a decrease up to 2002, 2003, and this was very much related to the acquisition and life cycle of geostationary satellites. So there has been a number of specific orders that were made in the 90s, and then the deliveries are happening, and then the satellites are operated, and for a few years there are less orders. So the bump we see at the beginning of the yellow curve is related to that. After this, the things have been rather smooth with growth, especially associated again to developing activities in the geostationary commercial market. And then you see this little erratic evolution since 2017, leading to, you know, the very low figures in 2024. And here again, it's the cycle of big orders in 1 year, and then, you know, they've been fulfilled in the years after. And then, you know, then this is not a very smooth domain. If you consider this geosatellite market, which is influencing strongly the yellow curve here, this is a market where there are between 10 and 15 orders every year. So, of course, you know, the year you have an order, you are registering a bit more revenue. The year of launch, you register a bit more. So this explains the erratic variations. But if you look at the overall profile of the curve, indeed you have, you know, kind of cyclical element. But the point we have now is that since 2017, as I was showing with the order intake chart, which I'm going to put back on the presentation now, if you look at the order intake, you see this is the one on the left. The clear trend on this specific segment of geostationary satellite is for less demand in the coming years. So nobody can say what the future would be, but this is one of the major trends. And if you consider that this business segment, the geostationary satellite segment, has represented 2 to 3 billion of business opportunity every year in the past 15 years for the European space segment, well, the fact that it is now receding strongly is a major point of concern. And as I was saying also, it is affecting more those players like the large four that were really very much present on this specific segment of the demand, and it is affecting less the mid-caps and the SMEs, which were not as invested on this specific segment. They can be affected as well, of course, but this is also one of the reasons why we see those contrasting evolutions between the large four on one side, the mid-caps, the SMEs, and the startups on the other hand.
Exactly. Yeah, thanks for clarifying. It was
You're welcome.
Interesting presentation. Yeah, that was it from my side.
Thank you very much. Do we have other questions? Maybe I keep the presentation on in case people have specific questions on some slides. So Charles, you will let me know if somebody's raising their hand and giving them the floor, please.
Yes, so far no hand raised.
Thank you.
And we have a question from Serge.
Please, Serge.
Yes, thank you so much, Pierre, and all the team. I have a question dedicated to the institutional budget on one side and institutional revenue by industry on the other side. If I have seen rightly your figures, the revenue, let's say the institutional budget is exactly 11.4 billion of euro, okay? And the institutional European revenue by industry only is 6.5, if I remember well.
Okay. It is. I'm showing it to you now.
6.5, huh? Okay, that's right. That means there is a difference of about, let's say, 5 billion of euro.
Right.
Okay. This 5 billion of euro, have you an idea of the share of this 5 billion of euro? I could imagine on my side that a part is going to RTOs to perform low TRL research activity for space.
No.
Other could go to science.
No. Actually, this is a different thing. So indeed, as I was mentioning, and you remember, Jean-Pierre Blanco was asking this very specific question. When I assessed this budget, this 11.4 billion, we try to eliminate the share which is actually going to fund the RTOs, because indeed we believe that this is not money which is available for the space programs themselves. Now, the difference of about 5 billion between the total budget and the actual revenue registered by industry is mostly related to two main factors. The first one is the money accumulating at the level of ESA, because ESA, due to the technical problems, the delays which are operated on the programs, is actually not implementing the money as fast as it would like. So a lot of that money is being stored in ESA and represents actual business opportunities that will still need to be released to industry. I believe that about 1 billion or 1.5 billion of this total budget, which is not yet implemented but is available in ESA, is there. Then there is also a share of the spending of the European institutions at large, ESA, but also EUSPA and CNES, etc., which is not going directly to fund space programs. ESA is also acquiring and maintaining a large infrastructure, test chambers, test beds, etc. This is not money that is going to space programs for flying in space, although it is money which is eventually supporting the development and production of space systems. So it is something which makes a lot of sense. But, it's like saying, I'm counting on one side the money which is going to buying cars, and separately the money which is going to building up a garage for the cars. So it's very relevant to the sector, but it is not spent on space systems and programs. Then ESA is also paying salaries like any other agency, and it also has IT support and normal operation costs, which represent a sizable share of the total spending of ESA and any other agency as well. So this difference in 5 billion is relevant to money not spent fast enough. That's the problem of executing the budget, and it's not easy with space programs, which have a lot of technicalities, a lot of issues arising. So programs may be delayed, but the money is already there at ESA at national level. And then there is also the share of spending of institutions, which is not going to the acquisition of space systems, which includes, as I said, salaries, overheads, any investment in infrastructure, which is not directly going to space systems development, which is what we are measuring with the Eurospace facts and figures survey. And there is also a little share of money which is not going to the industry directly, which is the acquisition of launch services. Of course, industry is building the launcher, but eventually this money is budgeted separately. So this explains why we have this very big difference. I like to say that as a rule of thumb, if you read about a budget for a space program somewhere, and if you're in the business of doing space systems development, production, and launch, probably half of that budget would be available to you in terms of a market opportunity at any single moment in time. That's the usual rule of thumb, which I've learned over 30 years of experience looking at those figures.
Thank you for your clarification.
You're welcome. Pierre again, please take the floor.
Sure, yes. Thank you, Pierre, once again. I would like to come back to your last concluding slide.
The one on the profit?
Yes. And just to make a remark on maybe the necessity to split this left-hand side curve to show the evolution according to the different typology of industry, mid caps, large groups, SMEs, etc. Because I'm aware that large groups are in bad shape, and that's and as you said, they are pulling the market somehow because they're in the top of the value chain and they pull the chain. Nevertheless, it might be interesting to show how other typologies, types of industry behave.
Yes, it would, Pierre, indeed. I agree, but companies are not very comfortable. When we manage at the level of the Eurospace Council to actually approve this action and trying and getting to collect the data, what we noticed that companies were very private with this data. They don't feel comfortable with sharing this, and I understand why. So trying to make now the split, with mid caps and SMEs would draw a too detailed picture and would give out too much information, probably for the companies to be comfortable with. On the other hand, if you look at the yellow curve on the left, This is the average profit rate without balancing the size of the companies. And what I can tell you, that I've looked individually at all the figures, is that we have decreasing profit rates almost everywhere in the sector. Small companies, medium companies, and large companies. Of course, the big losses that have been posted by those big players in those 2 recent years, they do actually affect a lot, particularly the brown curve. But don't be fooled. This is a situation which is affecting a large majority of space players in Europe today. It is not only with the primes. The primes, it's very acute, it's very vocal, super visible, and very, very big. But you should look into smaller companies and SMEs. The receding profit rate is a reality. Not all of them are losing money, but most of them have a trend of receding profits. And if you go and look for open source data, there is quite a lot if you know where to look. You will be surprised probably how often you will see negative profits and decreasing profits in the space industry. And when I say this is because, as you know, I'm looking at this data every year, every day, and I am concerned because I believe that space is not a profitable business as it used to be. And this is across the board, not only with the big. And indeed, for the big, it's big, okay? But yeah, it's happening almost everywhere. And again, some companies are faring very, very well, and really hats off to those few guys which are managing to go and navigate this difficult situation extremely well. Some are, but they're an exception. And again, it's very good that there are. They're probably an example for the others, but really you'd be surprised at how many are facing those decreasing profit rates, which is really exemplified by the yellow curve here.
Yeah, and maybe one could imagine that those guys that are doing so well are less capex, are less subject to capex investment.
Yes and no. Actually, I wouldn't put this as a rule because I think it's not applicable with the companies I have in mind. So no, I wouldn't say so. It's not a matter of capex at this point.
Okay.
I think it's really very much a matter of navigating the right program and business opportunities, but also it's very much a matter of having made a lot of good strategic choices in the past, which are paying off today, while again, one of the reasons why the big groups are having difficulties today is because of some choices that were made strategically in the past, which have been aberrated by market shifts which were faster than they would expect. And I'm trying to be very politically correct here, but you know, if you decrypt what I'm saying, you will understand.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you, Pierre.
You're welcome. So I think that we have almost filled up the time slot that we had allocated for this presentation. So I would like to give a very last opportunity for anybody to raise their hands if they want to make a comment or ask a question. So I am not seeing anything. So first let me thank all the companies which are participating in the survey, the 2 surveys actually, the facts and figures one and the profit survey, to supporting us for this. I would like to thank Eurospace members which are funding us and which are really making this data available for us and for the community at large. I would like to recall that this presentation will be available from our website as soon as this afternoon. I made a specific post. It's programmed to go live around noon, so it will be there. We will be circulating the full facts and figures report to all the eligible entities, which include the companies that participate in the survey, of course, the Eurospace member as well, the members of the press, and the European institutional members, so we have a mailing list. If you don't receive it, you can still contact me, Olivier, Charles, and see if you're eligible, and then we will send you a copy of the report free of charge, of course, if you're eligible to receive it. So again, thank you very much for being with us today, for your attention and time, and I wish you a very good afternoon.